Her child wept from hunger for 5 days until a lone rancher said, "Prepare to go with me." But what happened next shocked the whole town. New Mexico Territory, October 1873. The land was dry, the nights colder than mercy, and hunger ruled like a silent enemy. Inside a broken wooden cabin, a mother named Clara held her weak child close, listening to the sound of his soft cries that had not stopped for 5 endless days. No bread, no grain, no neighbor to answer, only the hollow wind scratching against the walls. Each sunrise felt heavier, each sunset darker, as if the world had forgotten them. Clara's heart ached with fear, yet her spirit refused to give up, for the life of her child was the only flame left burning. In this cruel silence of the Wild West, footsteps approached, slow and steady, breaking the emptiness of the desert night. A lone rancher was coming, and his arrival would turn despair into a story that the territory would never forget. The cabin stood at the edge of the desert, its walls trembling under the weight of wind that carried dust like a curse, and inside Clara clutched her little boy, pressing his fragile body to her chest as though her embrace alone could shield him from the hunger that gnawed at his tiny frame. His soft whimpers piercing the silence of endless nights that had stretched into 5 long days of emptiness, where not a crumb of bread remained, not a drop of milk, not even a grain forgotten in a corner jar, and her heart broke a little more each time his eyes searched hers for comfort she could not give. Yet she whispered lullabies through trembling lips to hide her despair, her voice quivering as she rocked him slowly by the weak glow of a dying lantern, whose flame flickered like their last hope. While outside the earth lay cracked and lifeless, the soil too hard to yield, the horizon empty of riders, neighbors, or mercy, and every gust against the walls reminded her of promises made by her late husband who had fallen months before in a senseless skirmish that left her alone with a child in a world that spared no kindness. But Clara did not weep, for tears had dried long ago when she realized crying would not fill her son's stomach. So she sat stiff in the chair, her hollow eyes watching the shadows stretch across the floor, each shadow whispering of the dangers that lurked beyond the door, raiders and drifters who would take what little they had if they came upon them. And so she prayed under her breath, her voice a faint murmur to a heaven that seemed deaf to her pleas, begging only for strength to see the boy through one more night, one more morning, one more breath, though even she knew the body could not survive on prayer alone. And as the 5th night closed in, the sound of his cries weakened, no longer sharp but fading, a thin whisper of suffering that terrified her more than the wails. For silence meant surrender, and she pressed her lips to his damp forehead, swearing to keep him alive no matter what darkness she must face. When suddenly from the distance came a sound so foreign it startled her, the faint rhythm of hooves against dry ground, slow, deliberate, echoing closer with each passing second, and her heart raced in confusion, fear and hope colliding inside her chest. Because riders at night could mean salvation or ruin, and in this unforgiving land strangers were often as dangerous as the hunger itself. Yet the sound grew louder until even her boy stirred weakly at the vibration, and Clara stood frozen, clutching him tightly, her bare feet rooted to the dirt floor, eyes fixed on the door as the lantern's flame swayed with the draft. And in that breathless moment she realized her world was about to change, though she did not know whether it would be toward light or into deeper shadows. The door rattled as the knocking echoed through the frail boards, steady and strong, and Clara's breath caught in her throat, her arms tightening around her child, as if the stranger outside could feel her fear bleeding through the wood, and she stood motionless, staring at the weak lantern light that quivered with each strike, her mind torn between opening to possible salvation or keeping closed against the dangers that roamed the lawless land. Yet the sound of her boy's soft sob behind her pushed her closer to the door, step by trembling step, until she could almost feel the cold night air seeping through the cracks. And outside Ethan stood tall beside his weary horse, dust clinging to his coat, his hat shadowing eyes that had seen too many hard roads, his hand resting gently on the worn leather of his saddle as though ready for either fight or mercy, his ear catching the faint cry of a child that reached him, even through the heavy silence of the desert. And his jaw tightened with resolve, for he knew hunger when he heard it. He knew despair in the pitch of a voice too small to carry weight. And though the hour was late and strangers were seldom welcomed, something deeper than caution urged him to wait, to give one more knock, slower this time, firm yet patient. And inside Clara's heart raced so wildly she thought it might betray her, the memory of nights when outlaws pounded doors flashing in her mind. But the tone of this knock felt different, carrying not demand but an echo of concern, and still her hand trembled as it reached for the latch, her lips whispering a prayer half-finished, the boy shifting weakly in her arms as if sensing that the moment before them would decide whether morning would ever come. And when she finally pulled the door just enough to see, The lantern's glow spilled into the night and revealed the man standing there, his figure cut against the barren land, his face lined by years of sun and hardship, yet softened by eyes that carried neither greed nor malice, only a steady weight of purpose. And for a long second they stared at each other, two souls bound by silence, until Ethan removed his hat slowly, a gesture of respect that felt foreign in the wilderness, and his voice broke the stillness, low and rough but calm, asking if she needed help. And Clara's throat tightened so hard no words came, only the sound of her child's whimper rising between them, and Ethan's eyes flicked to the boy, his expression hardening not in anger, but in recognition of suffering, his stance straightening as if fate had placed him there not by chance but by duty. And before Clara could decide, before she could weigh fear against trust, Ethan spoke again, his words simple yet heavy with promise, telling her he had food, telling her he had space, telling her she must prepare to go with him. Clara froze, her back pressed against the doorframe, Ethan's words lingering in the air like a promise wrapped in danger, and her boy shifted weakly in her arms, his thin face tilted toward the stranger as though even he knew that choice hovered between life and death. And in that moment Clara's heart thrashed inside her chest, torn between fear of betrayal and the unbearable thought of watching her child fade into silence, the weight of her husband's absence pressing against her mind, reminding her that no protector remained, no family waited, only this lone rancher with steady eyes and a voice that carried both command and compassion. And as the wind howled across the barren land, she wondered if God himself had sent this man, or if opening her trust would deliver ruin. Yet the boy's shallow breath made the question burn sharper, leaving her no refuge in hesitation. So she searched Ethan's face, looking for a crack of deceit, but found only tired lines carved by dust and distance, and still her fingers clenched around her child as if letting go might shatter her, until Ethan stepped closer. Lowering his voice to a whisper meant not to frighten but to steady her trembling spirit, telling her again to prepare, telling her time was thin, telling her she had more to lose if she stayed than if she left. And Clara felt the world shrink to a single decision, the kind that cannot be reversed once taken, and the silence between them stretched long and heavy, filled only by the boy's faint cry, until her lips parted and she nodded almost without breath, the choice tearing through her like a blade, but also lifting a weight that had been crushing her chest for days. And she gathered what little they had, a small blanket worn thin, a piece of ribbon from her husband's coat, and she wrapped her boy tighter, stepping out into the night where the lantern's glow surrendered to darkness, her bare feet meeting the cold dirt with resolve. And Ethan watched without a word, only reaching for the reins of his horse, his movements careful, deliberate, as though he knew one wrong gesture might break her fragile trust. And when Clara stood beside him, the desert stretched wide, silent and merciless, but she felt the faint stir of something she had not known since her husband lived, a sliver of hope buried beneath her grief. And though fear gnawed at her with every breath, she mounted behind Ethan, clutching her child to her chest. And as the horse shifted under them, she looked back at the cabin that had been her prison and her shelter, its roof sagging, its walls cracked, the place where her tears had fallen unseen. And she knew she was leaving behind more than wood and stone. She was leaving the life of despair. And in that final glance she whispered a farewell, then lowered her head against her boy, while Ethan urged the horse forward into the endless night. The horse carried them into the vast darkness, hooves striking the hard earth in a rhythm that echoed like a heartbeat against the silence of the desert night. And Clara held her boy so tightly against her chest, she could feel the frail rise and fall of his breath beneath the thin blanket, her eyes scanning the emptiness that stretched on every side, where jagged rocks cast long shadows, and the barren land whispered of danger. For out here hunger was not the only enemy. Men without conscience roamed the territory, outlaws who would take a life as quickly as a coin, and every sound carried weight. The cry of a distant coyote, the rustle of dry grass, the groan of wind curling around the ridges, all of it feeding the fear already burning in her veins. Yet Ethan's steady posture on the saddle kept her from unraveling, his hands firm on the reins, his eyes fixed ahead as though he could see a path invisible to anyone else. And though he said little, his silence carried strength, a message that he would not falter no matter how long the road stretched. But as the moon slipped behind a cloud, the darkness grew so heavy, Clara felt swallowed by it, the child shifting weakly, his tiny hand clutching at her dress, and she whispered softly to calm him, though her own voice shook, while behind them, she thought she heard the faint echo of horses not their own, distant, yet real. And her chest tightened at the thought that outlaws could be trailing them, shadows hidden within shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. And Ethan seemed to sense it too, for he pressed his heels gently to the horse, urging it faster, his head turning just enough to scan the ridge lines, his jaw set with quiet defiance. And Clara felt the rush of air sting her face as they rode harder, the wind pulling at her hair, the night swallowing her words, but she dared not speak, for fear that even the sound of her breath might draw death closer, and so she buried her face against her boy, clinging to the fragile warmth of his body, whispering a prayer that they might see dawn, while Ethan guided them through dry gullies and narrow passes where shadows twisted into shapes of men with guns, though none appeared. Yet the weight of pursuit never left them, pressing down like a storm waiting to break, and every step forward felt like defiance against a world that wanted them lost. Yet still the rancher pushed on, shoulders unyielding, gaze unbroken, and in that relentless drive Clara found a fragment of strength she thought she had lost. For though she trembled, though fear scraped her raw, a flicker of hope sparked within her chest as the horse carried them farther from despair, deeper into the unknown night where the line between survival and ruin thinned with every mile. As the horizon bled into pale gold, the outline of Ethan's ranch rose from the emptiness like a promise carved into the land, its fences strong, its roof whole, smoke lifting from a chimney that spoke of fire and food, and Clara's heart trembled at the sight, for after endless miles of fear, the air itself seemed different here, filled not with despair but with the scent of life. And when they crossed the gate, Ethan dismounted and reached for her boy with hands steady yet gentle, carrying him inside where bread waited on a wooden table, steam rising from a pot that filled the room with warmth. And as the child tasted food, his lips curved into the first fragile smile she had seen in days, breaking her resolve into tears that poured freely down her face. For in that moment she knew the journey had not only saved them from death, but had carried them into a beginning, where loss no longer ruled and hope had a home.